How does one pilot, alone and outnumbered 64 to 1, not only survive but fight back? When the sky itself darkens with enemy aircraft, what desperate maneuver remains? In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the South Pacific, in the desperate spring of 1943, a single American fighter pilot would face a swarm of Japanese warplanes so large it defied belief. This is not a story of a grand squadron engagement, but of a solitary warrior's defiance. The story of an engine scream against a chorus of foes, of a cockpit shaking under fire, and of a split-second decision that transformed a certain death sentence into a legend of survival. We are over the Solomon Sea, north of New Guinea, on a day when the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a devastating strike aimed at crushing Allied air power in the region. And in the path of this aerial armada, flying a lone reconnaissance mission in his Warhawk, was a young pilot from the 8th Fighter Group 36 Fighter Squadron. His name was Second Lieutenant John Jack H. Moore, and what he did when 64 Japanese planes descended upon him would become one of the most incredible one-man stands in the history of aerial combat. To comprehend the sheer scale of the threat Jack Moore faced, we must first set the strategic stage. By April 1943, the tide of war in the Pacific was beginning its slow, bloody turn. The Guadalcanal campaign had ended in an Allied victory, but the Japanese were far from defeated. They were determined to reinforce their major stronghold at Rabaul on New Britain and maintain their air superiority over the vital Solomon Sea and the northern coast of New Guinea. The Allies, consolidating forces, had established a key forward airfield at Dobodura, New Guinea. From here, the 5th Air Force, under the aggressive command of General George Kenney, struck Japanese shipping and airfields, threatening their supply lines. The 8th Fighter Group, known as the Burma Banshees, though now operating in the Pacific, was a veteran unit equipped with the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. The P-40 was a tough, dependable aircraft, but by 1943, it was outclassed in many respects by newer Japanese fighters like the Agile A-6M0. Its strengths were its rugged construction, heavy armament of 650 caliber machine guns, and excellent high-speed dive performance. Pilots learned to use it not in turning dogfights with Zeros, but in slashing, hit-and-run attacks, using their superior firepower and diving speed to advantage. Jack Moore, a 22-year-old from Kansas, was one such pilot. He had already seen combat, developing the sharp eyes and instincts necessary for survival in the deadly skies over New Guinea. The Japanese plan for April 14, 1943, was a massive, coordinated strike designed to obliterate Allied air power at Dobodura. Intelligence, gathered from coast watchers and radio intercepts, indicated a large force was being assembled at Rabaul. In response, the 8th Fighter Group scheduled patrols and reconnaissance missions. Moore's mission that day was not to seek a fight, but to be the eyes of the command. He was assigned a solo fighter sweep and reconnaissance patrol along the probable approach routes from New Britain to New Guinea. His orders were to observe and report any enemy activity, not to engage unless absolutely necessary. He took off from Dobodura's dusty strip at 1,000 hours in his P-40K, a model with a more powerful engine, its shark's teeth mouth painted vividly on the nose. The weather was typical for the region, towering cumulus clouds building over the ocean, offering both cover and danger, with patches of brilliant sunlight breaking through. Moore checked his instruments, his 6 guns, and settled into the long, lonely scan of the endless blue sea below. He was a sentinel in the sky, and on this day, he would witness the approaching storm long before it reached the shore. For the first hour of his patrol, the world was deceptively peaceful. Moore droned northwards at 15,000 feet, the rhythmic thrum of his Allison V1710 engine a constant companion. He meticulously scanned each quadrant of the sky, his eyes moving from the endless expanse of ocean to the shimmering horizon, to the massive cloud formations that could conceal an entire squadron. The solitude of such a mission could play tricks on the mind, but Moore remained vigilant. He checked his position by dead reckoning. The coast of New Guinea a faint smudge to the south. He was now over open water, the Solomon Sea, a no-man's land where any contact was almost certainly hostile. Then, at approximately 11:20 hours, he saw them. At first, it was just a distant, dark smudge on the northwestern horizon, like a low-lying cloud bank, but it was moving against the wind. Moore felt a cold jolt of adrenaline. He eased his throttle forward, gaining a little altitude for a better view. As he narrowed the distance, the smudge resolved into distinct shapes. Not a few aircraft, Not even a squadron. It was an armada. A massive, sprawling formation of Japanese warplanes, stacked in layers, moving with purposeful intent towards New Guinea. His mouth went dry. Through his binoculars, he began to count, his training overriding his initial shock. He identified the distinct silhouettes, the sleek, deadly forms of Mitsubishi A6M0's flying top cover, weaving protectively. Below them, the heavier, twin-engine shapes of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, their long, pencil-like fuselages unmistakable. And weaving among them were other fighters, possibly the newer Kawasaki Ki-61 Tonys. The formation stretched for miles. Moore's mind raced. He completed his count as best he could from a distance. The number was staggering. 24 Betty bombers, escorted by a staggering 40 fighter aircraft, a mix of Zeros and Tonys. 64 enemy planes. His lone P-40 was a gnat against this swarm. His immediate duty was clear: get a warning back to WWII. He banked his Warhawk steeply away, hoping the clouds would shield him, and grabbed his radio microphone. WWII Control, this is Black Sheep 27. I have a visual on a large enemy formation, bearing approximately 210 degrees from my position, range 50 miles, heading 150. Estimate 24 Betty bombers, 40 fighter escort. Repeat, 64 enemy aircraft inbound. I am turning to shadow. Over. The radio crackled with static, then the controller's urgent voice. Roger, 27. Recopy 64 bandits inbound. All squadrons, scramble. Scramble. 27, maintain distance and observe. Do not, repeat, do not engage. The order was unambiguous. His role was to be a spectator, to track the formation and report its course. But fate and physics had other plans. As Moore turned to parallel the massive Japanese formation from a safe distance of several miles, riding the edge of a large cloud bank for cover, a tragic flaw in his aircraft revealed itself. The P-40KS radio, notoriously unreliable and prone to overheating, chose this moment to fail. The constant transmission, combined with the tropical heat, had burned out a critical component. One moment he was listening to the frantic scramble orders from base, the next, his headphones erupted in a loud pop followed by dead silence. He frantically cycled the switches, tapped the microphone, but there was nothing. He was deaf, mute, and utterly alone. The only link to his home, to warning his comrades on the ground who were now scrambling into their own fighters, was severed. New, more immediate terror gripped him. To continue shadowing the formation, he had to stay relatively close. But without radio, he could not vector the scrambling Allied fighters, a mix of P-38 Lightnings and more P-40s, towards the enemy. They would be scrambling blind, hoping to intercept based on his initial, now static, report. His mission had just escalated from reconnaissance to critical interception coordination, and his primary tool was gone. He made a fateful decision. He would close the distance slightly, get a precise fix on the formation's heading and speed, and then break away at full throttle to try to reach the intercepting Allied forces and guide them visually. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. He pushed the throttle forward, the Allison engine responding with a deeper roar. He descended slightly, using a lower cloud layer as a screen, aiming to cut across behind the massive formation to get an accurate tail observation. For 10 minutes, the delicate ballet continued, the huge, lumbering Japanese strike force plowing forward, utterly unaware of the single, tiny American shadow flitting along the edges of their world. Moore was so focused on the bombers and their close escorts that he failed to account for the high top cover Zeros, flying thousands of feet above. One sharp-eyed Japanese pilot, scanning the periphery of the formation, caught a glint of sunlight on a canopy far below and behind. A lone aircraft, not matching any known Japanese silhouette, tailing them. The Zero pilot rocked his wings, signaling to his wingmen, and the two fighters peeled off from their high station, nosing over into a shallow dive to investigate. Moore's first warning was instinctual, a prickling on the back of his neck. He glanced up and to his right. Two specks, growing rapidly larger, were detaching from the high cover and angling towards him. They were still distant, but their intent was clear. He was made. The game was up. He shoved the throttle to the firewall, entering war emergency power. The P-40 surged forward, but he knew he couldn't outrun the lighter Zeros in a straight line, especially not while they had the altitude advantage. He was still heavily outnumbered, but now the calculus had changed from evasion to a fight for his very life. The two Zeros, recognizing the American fighters' attempt to flee, increased their dive angle, their engines screaming as they sought to cut him off. Moore's mind was a whirlwind of tactical calculations. He couldn't turn with them. He couldn't outclimb them. His only advantage was in a dive and his heavier firepower. He rolled his P-40 onto its back and pulled the stick hard into his stomach, executing a screaming split S, diving straight down towards the ocean below, a tactic to convert his altitude into speed. The two Zeros followed, their pilots confident. 1 against 2 was odds they relished. What happened next was a blur of violent maneuvering. Moore let the Warhawk accelerate in the dive, the airframe shuddering as he passed through 400 miles per hour. The Zeros pursued, but the P-40, a heavier aircraft, was gaining speed faster. At 10,000 feet, he pulled out of the dive with crushing G-forces, blacking out for a second before his vision returned. He reversed his turn, coming back up in a high-speed yo-yo. 1 Zero, overeager, had overshot his dive. For a split second, the other Zero filled his reflector sight. Moore didn't hesitate. A 1-second burst from his .650 caliber sent a converging stream of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds into the Japanese fighter's engine and cockpit. The Zero shuddered, erupted in flame, and spun away towards the sea. The first kill was swift, almost clinical, but the victory was empty. The sound of his guns, the sight of the falling Zero, had acted as a beacon. The entire Japanese fighter screen, now alerted to a lone, aggressive American in their midst, began to react. Dozens of Zeros and Tonys broke from escorting the bombers and turned towards the distant speck of Moore's P-40. The swarm was now turning its attention to the single, defiant gnat that had stung it. By 11:50 hours, Jack Moore found himself in a nightmare scenario. His radio was dead. He was over 150 miles from base. Below him was the empty Solomon Sea, and above, around, and behind him, the sky was filling with enemy fighters. Not 2, not 4, but 20, then 30, as more and more broke off to deal with this unexpected threat. The Betty bombers, their mission secure, droned on towards New Guinea, but their protectors were now focused on a single kill. Moore became the epicenter of a whirling, chaotic dogfight, or more accurately, a desperate evasion. He was not fighting to shoot down enemies. He was fighting simply to stay alive for the next 10 seconds. Tracers began to stitch the air around him. The metallic thwack, thwack, thwack of 7.7 millimeters and 20 millimeters cannon rounds striking his airframe became a constant percussion. His P-40 was shuddering from hits. A warning light flickered for his coolant temperature. A hole appeared in his right wing. He threw the aircraft into a series of violent, gut-wrenching turns, dives, and climbs, never following a predictable pattern. He used the P-40 as sturdy construction to his advantage, taking hits that would have sheared the wings off a more fragile Zero. He would dive away at high speed, then use a cloud for momentary cover, only to burst out the other side into the gun sights of another waiting fighter. The loneliness was absolute. There were no women to call for help, no friendly voices on the radio. It was just his breath, ragged in his oxygen mask, the roar of his straining engine, and the endless, terrifying kaleidoscope of enemy aircraft in his mirror. The crisis point came not from a single, catastrophic hit, but from a gradual, terrifying erosion of his ability to fight back. After nearly 20 minutes of this relentless, swirling combat, Moore's ammunition was running critically low. His gun charger was malfunctioning, leaving only 4 of his .650 calibers firing intermittently. His engine, having been run at war emergency power for extended periods and punctured by shell fragments, was overheating badly. Thick, white glycol coolant vapor began streaming from his cowling, leaving a telltale white trail across the sky, a beacon for every Japanese pilot. His airspeed was dropping, his maneuvers becoming sluggish as he fought to keep the overheating engine from seizing entirely. Worse, the Japanese pilots, initially frustrated by his aggressive and unpredictable flying, were now coordinating. They began making synchronized attacks from different angles. While 2 Zeros pressed him from behind, forcing him to brake, a third would dive from above, and a fourth would climb from below. It was a classic hammer and anvil tactic, and against so many, it was inexorable. At approximately 12-15 hours, the inevitable severe damage occurred. A 20mm cannon shell from a diving Ki-61 Tony exploded against his right wing root near the fuselage. The impact was like a giant's fist slamming the aircraft. The controls went momentarily slack, then fought him as the aileron cables were damaged. The P-40 yawed violently to the right. Simultaneously, a stream of 7.7 millimeters bullets from a Zero catching him in a turn walked across his canopy, shattering the plexiglass. Shards ripped at his face and flight jacket. Cold, roaring wind blasted into the cockpit, tearing at his charts and equipment. He was now flying a wounded, barely controllable aircraft, half blinded by wind and blood from facial cuts, with a dying engine and precious little ammunition. Surrounded by over 40 enemy fighters who knew he was on his last legs. The despair that washed over Jack Moore in that moment was profound. There was no noble last stand possible. He was too low on ammo to take many more with him. He was too far from land to glide. Bailing out over the Solomon Sea meant almost certain capture by Japanese patrol boats or death by exposure and sharks. Every tactical option had been exhausted. The Japanese fighters, sensing the kill, closed in for the final blows. They became more aggressive, getting in closer for definitive shots. Tracers converged on his aircraft from all directions. The sound of rounds impacting his airframe was constant. His instrument panel was a mess of shattered glass and flickering warning lights. The stench of cordite, hot metal, and glycol filled the shattered cockpit. This was it. After a defiant, 30-minute solo battle against impossible odds, the end had come. He was going to die in this broken machine, alone in a vast, uncaring ocean sky. In a final, almost reflexive act, he reached for the ripcord of his parachute pack, his fingers fumbling with the buckle, his mind already preparing for the shock of the cold water below. He had one last, fleeting thought. He had at least gotten the warning through. Maybe it would be enough for the boys at WWII. But as his hand touched the parachute release, his eyes, scanning the chaos outside his shattered canopy for a place to ditch or bail, caught sight of something he had not considered before. A massive, towering cumulonimbus cloud, an immense thunderhead, loomed directly in his flight path, about 2 miles ahead. It was a monster of a storm cloud, its anvil top stretching up to 40,000 feet, its base a dark, bruised purple, pregnant with rain and turbulent energy. Such clouds were the nightmares of pilots, filled with lethal updrafts, downdrafts, hail, and static electricity that could tear an aircraft apart. Standard procedure was to navigate miles around them. Every instinct, every line in his pilot's manual screamed to avoid it. But in that instant, Jack Moore saw not a death trap, but a sanctuary. The Japanese fighters, lighter and more fragile than his Warhawk, were even more vulnerable to severe turbulence. Their tactics relied on visibility and formation flying, things impossible inside a thunderhead. It was a terrifying, suicidal gamble. Entering that cloud meant surrendering all control, risking structural failure from turbulence, icing up, or a fatal lightning strike. But staying in the clear sky meant certain death from the swarm of Zeros and Tonys. It was a choice between two forms of annihilation. With a surge of desperate resolve, Moore made his decision. He would not bail out. He would not be shot down. He would fly into the heart of the storm. With his last ounces of power and control, Moore aimed his shuddering, trailing smoke Warhawk directly at the darkest, most ominous part of the thunderhead. He ignored the Japanese fighters still nipping at his heels, their tracers flashing past. All his concentration was on reaching the wall of cloud. The Japanese pilots, seeing their prey heading for the storm, hesitated. Some broke off their attacks, wary of the turbulent monster. A few, perhaps thinking he was trying a final, desperate escape, pressed on, firing long, futile bursts as the distance opened. The cloud face rushed towards him, a swirling gray mass that swallowed the world. At 12:28 hours, Jack Moore's P-40 plunged into the abyss. The world dissolved into a roaring, gray-white chaos. One moment he was in bright sunlight, the next he was blind. Visibility dropped to zero. The aircraft was instantly seized by violent, unpredictable forces. It was thrown upward with such force that Moore was slammed into his seat, then dropped into a stomach-lurching downdraft that felt like the bottom had fallen out of the sky. Icing began to form instantly on the wings and shattered canopy edges. Hail the size of marbles drummed a deafening tattoo on the aircraft's skin. St. Elmo's fire, eerie blue electrical discharges, danced along his gun barrels and propeller. The turbulence was beyond anything he had ever experienced. It was like being in a tin can shaken by a giant. He could not see his instruments, could not tell if he was right side up or inverted. He fought the controls, but they were useless against such raw power. He was no longer flying the aircraft. He was merely a passenger clinging to a piece of metal being tossed through a celestial washing machine. But his gamble had one crucial element of genius. It was an environment equally hostile to every aircraft within it. The pursuing Japanese fighters, those that had followed him in, were now in the same lethal maelstrom. The lighter, more delicate Zero airframes were even less suited to such punishment. In the utter blindness and violence of the cloud, formation flying, communication, and coordinated attack were impossible. Each pilot was alone, fighting for his own survival against the storm. Morse P-40, battered as it was built like a truck. Its sturdy construction, which had allowed it to absorb cannon fire, now allowed it to withstand the terrifying buffeting. It was being brutally beaten, but it was holding together. He could hear and feel terrifying groans and creaks from the airframe, but it did not disintegrate. For what felt like an eternity, but was in reality about 8 minutes, Moore endured this hell. He tried to maintain a rough, instinctual level attitude, but it was futile. He was completely at the mercy of the storm. The only thing he could do was reduce power to try to ease the strain on the engine and airframe, and pray. The noise was overwhelming. The scream of the wind, the roar of the engine laboring against the elements, the crash of hail, and the constant, terrifying banging and groaning of tortured metal. His damaged cockpit, already open to the elements, was now flooded with icy condensation-heavy air. He was soaked, freezing, and utterly disoriented. Then, as suddenly as he had entered it, he was flung out the other side. The P-40 was ejected from the base of the thunderhead like a cork from a bottle. He found himself in a torrential rain shower, but with blessed visibility. He was in a steep, spiraling dive, only a few thousand feet above the churning ocean. He hauled back on the stick with all his remaining strength, fighting the damaged controls. The aircraft responded sluggishly, leveling out just a few hundred feet above the white-capped waves. His first, frantic act was to look behind him. The sky was empty. No Zeros. No Tonys. The storm had scattered them, driven them off, or possibly claimed some of them. He was alone. The immense, towering cloud now stood between him and the Japanese strike force, which had presumably continued on its mission. He had used the storm as a shield, a chaotic, impenetrable barrier. But he was far from safe. His engine was now critically damaged. The coolant temperature gauge was pegged in the red, and it was only a matter of minutes, perhaps seconds, before it seized completely. He was lost, his compass spinning from electrical interference in the storm. He was low on fuel, wounded, and flying a crippled aircraft over open ocean. Yet, he had achieved the impossible. He had escaped the swarm. Now, a new battle began, the battle of navigation and endurance. Using the sun's position through the breaking clouds and a crude mental map, he estimated a general southerly course towards New Guinea. He coaxed the failing engine, nursing it with a lean fuel mixture, listening with dread to the increasing knocks and rattles from within. The P-40 became a glider with a noisy, failing motor. Every minute was a gift. He scanned the horizon desperately for land, any land. The loneliness returned, but it was a different kind. No longer the loneliness of being hunted, but the loneliness of the shipwrecked, adrift in an endless, blue desert. Miraculously, after over 40 minutes of desperate, uncertain flight, a dark green smudge appeared on the horizon. It was the coast of New Guinea. He didn't know exactly where he was, but it was land. With his engine emitting a final, metallic shriek and seizing solid, Jack Moore performed a dead stick landing on the first stretch of flat ground he could find, a rough, muddy area near a coastal village far from any Allied airfield. The P-40, its landing gear torn off by the rough ground, slid to a shuddering halt, a broken, steaming wreck. He was alive. He climbed out of the shattered cockpit, his body trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion, his flight suit stained with blood and oil. He was soon found by local villagers and eventually picked up by an Australian patrol. His story, when he finally made it back to WWII later that evening, was met with utter disbelief. A lone P-40 engaging 64 enemy aircraft, surviving for over 30 minutes, escaping by flying into a thunderhead. It sounded like the fantastical tale of a shell-shocked pilot. But the evidence was compelling. His aircraft, though wrecked, bore the scars of an incredible fight. Over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes were later counted in the airframe. His gun camera film, though damaged, showed brief, chaotic footage of multiple enemy aircraft and his confirmed kill of the Zero. Most importantly, his initial radio warning, though cut short, had given WWII just enough time. The scrambled Allied interceptors, though unable to find the main bomber force without his continued guidance, had disrupted the Japanese attack. which ultimately proved less effective than planned. The intelligence about the size and composition of the strike was invaluable. For his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Second Lieutenant John H. Moore was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The official citation detailed his solo engagement against overwhelming odds, his tenacity in continuing to fight and report despite a disabled radio, and his extraordinary airmanship in evading destruction. The story spread through the 5th Air Force and became a legendary morale booster, a testament to the idea that no matter the odds, skill, courage, and a bit of sheer, unadulterated daring could snatch survival from the jaws of annihilation. Jack Moore's mission had a lasting impact beyond the medal. It underscored the critical importance of reliable communications in aerial warfare, hastening improvements in fighter radio sets. It became a case study in extreme asymmetric air combat, taught in fighter pilot schools as an example of using environmental factors as a force multiplier. And most of all, it cemented the legend of the P-40 Warhawk and the men who flew it, not as the masters of the sky, but as tenacious, tough-as-nails fighters who could absorb unbelievable punishment and, sometimes through a combination of grit and genius, accomplish the impossible. Moore returned to combat, flying P-38s later in the war, but April 14, 1943, remained the defining moment of his life. It was the day one man, in one plane, stared down an air fleet and lived to tell the tale. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to War Legend Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.